Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the third annual American Judaic Legal Symposium hosted by the Ben Arroyo Jewish Learning Academy here in Portland, Oregon. First of all, I want to thank our panelists, Professor Dershowitz and Rabbi Yaffee. Thank you very much for being here and for making this possible. Zoom has created a smaller world that has brought us together in ways that were so much more distant prior to that. Thank you to our participants, to everybody who is here, both those who are here in the Zoom room, and also this is being live streamed onto YouTube. So thank you to those who are with us in both of those. We have an incredible panel. We have Alan Dershowitz, who doesn't need introduction yet. I will read some of his bio here. Professor Alan Dershowitz is a Brooklyn native who has been called the nation's most peripatetic civil liberties lawyer and is one of the most distinguished defenders of individual rights, the best known criminal lawyer in the world, the top lawyer of last resort, America's most public Jewish defender, and Israel's single most visible defender, the Jewish state's lead attorney in the court of public opinion. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor at Law at Harvard Law School. Dershowitz is a graduate of Brooklyn College and Yale Law School, joined the Harvard Law School faculty at the age of 25 after clerking for Judge David Bazelon and Justice Arthur Goldberg. He has also published more than 1,000 articles in magazines, newspapers, journals, and blogs such as the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, Huffington Post, Newsmax, Jerusalem Post, and Haaretz. And significantly, in his bio, which is posted on the Harvard Law School's page, it says that his areas of interest are comparative and foreign law and Jewish law. So this is the perfect place and perfect interest for you. Thank you very much, Professor Dershowitz, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
We have also Rabbi Shlomo Yaffee. Rabbi Yaffee is the Dean of the Institute of American and Talmudic Law in New York, New York. He's the director of the Institute for Judaic Knowledge and a member of the editorial staff at Chabad.org. Rabbi Yaffee has lectured, led seminars, and visiting scholar programs throughout North America, as well as Mexico, Europe, and Africa, as well as having written extensively for various forums. He's authored several turnkey educational programs, including serving as lead author for the Roar Jewish Learning Institute's JLI Living with Integrity course. He recently completed an appointment as scholar in residence at the Chabad House in Harvard, serving the Harvard and MIT communities. In his capacity of Dean of the Institute, he has sat in panels with distinguished members of the bar, including Justice Scalia of the Supreme Court of the United States. Rabbi Yaffee is a pioneer in the American and Judaic comparative law symposiums such as these, and he's also a personal mentor of mine who showed me and trained me and guided me in developing this program and throughout the years many times. So Rabbi Yaffee, thank you for being here, and we're looking very much forward to today's topic and today's symposium. Rabbi Yaffee and Professor Dershowitz, we live in a very, very unique time. There is a pandemic that's raging the world, which is causing people to limit both their civil liberties and their religious liberties. On the religious side, as a rabbi, there's some fascinating and moving changes or effects of this pandemic. One of the rights of importance in Judaism is the way we bury our dead. One of the saddest parts of the pandemic was knowing that some of our greatest Jewish leaders and Jewish teachers didn't even receive a proper Jewish burial. And that's something that was a preemptive measure to stop the spread of pandemic. So I'm going to ask Rabbi Yaffee first, you can talk to us a little bit about, in Judaic law, what are the parameters that constitute a public health need? What allows government or religious institutions to preemptively curb personal rights and freedoms? What historical precedences do we have for such situations? Rabbi Yaffee.
So Maimonides here in this slide is talking about, it's the laws of the foundations of the Torah, the very beginning of Maimonides' code, which remains to this day the only code that encompasses basically all of Jewish life and belief. So Maimonides lays this out, and this appears in numerous places in both the Babylonian and Israeli Talmud. It appears, and it's constantly reiterated down to this day. So just as these principles apply regarding being forced to transgress, they also apply regarding sicknesses. What is implied? When a person becomes sick and is in danger of dying, if the physicians say that his cure involves transgressing a given Torah prohibition, the physician's advice should be followed. When there is danger to life, one may use any of the Torah prohibitions as a remedy, with the exception of the worship of false gods, forbidden sexual relations, and murder. Even when there is a danger to life, one may not use them as a remedy. If one transgresses and uses them as a remedy, the court may impose the appropriate punishment upon it. The question is, what constitutes danger? So the answer is, we can once again look to a key point of the laws of saving someone's life, that if someone is injured, even if we think there's a very small chance that they will survive, we're allowed to break the Shabbat and all other laws of the Torah in order to rescue them, even for some temporary life. But it's very clear, as we'll see later in the text, that anything that the halachic authorities, the authorities who define Jewish law, which is more fragmented today, but it exists. But that basically, whoever your halachic authority is, okay, they have the absolute right to impose any coercive measure, including penalties and punishment, and certainly coercion via financial movement, putting on a mask, etc. Because once there is a value of the Torah at stake, which in this case is saving life, which, as we'll see, we have some texts which demonstrate how important it is. So there exists absolute a blanket fiat for the rabbis to do whatever they see fit. And if you'll notice the words here, they're really important. If the physicians say, what is the definition of danger to life that triggers this whole cascade of legal remedies, whatever the opinion of physicians is, which means to say there are obviously fringes to this, but we can say that the generally accepted medical wisdom that is professed by the majority of people, and indeed there's a commentary on the Code of Jewish Law that says those certified by the authorities of that kingdom. So in other words, the mainstream majority medical profession defines reality in each generation according to Jewish law. Those are the key parameters. Am I missing anything that you wanted to talk about?
So thank you, Rabbi Yaffee, and kind of laying out that in Judaism, the value is in the Hebrew term known as pikuach nefesh, which means if there's a danger of life, that basically takes precedence over all other religious rights, and that parameter of law that right now we have strictly limited a lot of the religious rights, the religious ways. Jews who didn't miss, the Yom Kippur service, Kol Nidre, even when they were in the Warsaw Ghetto, this year stayed home and said Yom Kippur and said Kol Nidre on their own because of this pikuach nefesh concern. And Professor Dershowitz, we're seeing now in America, we're seeing the civil liberties curbed in a way that we've never seen. People are not allowed to go to their own family gatherings, maybe not allowed to get together for Thanksgiving. People are not allowed to operate their businesses in many cases. A real kind of curb on and a halt on many of the liberties that are at the foundation of our country and our constitutional rights. So what is the precedence for this? What is the historical context for this? Is this something that is the first time that this is happening? And from where is the law coming at this point?
Well, as Ecclesiastes said, there's nothing new under the sun. And so there's always a precedent. There's rarely an exact precedent. There is a kind of Jewish approach. And that approach is a very holy and significant and important approach. And I think we all acknowledge that the approach does focus on pikuach nefesh, the elevation of life. I have placed before you life and death, God says. Ubacharto b'chayim, choose life, choose life. And that has been the leading source. And we as a people tragically have been tested too many times. And too many times we have had to choose between life and death. And we chose life, but others chose death for us. You mentioned violating of the rules of Shabbat. The only organization that I'm on the board of directors of is Hatzalah in Israel. And I love Hatzalah because they save lives every day. And it's remarkable to see that the most frum Jew sitting in Yom Kippur services during Ne'ilah, and he's wearing his beeper because all members of Hatzalah must wear them 365, not, Jews say, I'm with you 24/6, not Hatzalah. Hatzalah, I'm with you 24/7. A Jew will get on his motorcycle during Ne'ilah to save a Muslim woman who is having a problem living. And Hatzalah doesn't distinguish between Jewish life and non-Jewish life. So yes, Ubacharta b'chayim is very, very, very important. That all is by way of introduction to the incredibly complex Jewish approach to making tragic choices. And that's what these are, tragic choices. Some choices are easy. And here I want to discuss what you said, Rabbi, about the Jewish way of burying, the Jewish way of marrying. Remember, there's a difference between the halakha and the custom. Halakha doesn't require a large wedding. It requires basically two people. It doesn't even require a rabbi. You can get married, just the two people. You say the right words and you're married. The tradition requires the breaking of the cup and the dancing and the chairs. But when you put tradition rather than halacha against the saving of life, it's an easy choice, unfortunately, for many, but it's an easy choice. And we should not elevate tradition and custom over the need to save life. And so I have been critical of what has gone on in my hometown of Borough Park, where there have been large funerals and large weddings and other large gatherings, which are not made necessary by halacha. You have to have purely objective standards. How many people, how many feet, all of that. And Jews learn how to adapt very quickly. My shul, Park East, Rabbi Schneier, over the Yomim Noraim did a terrific thing. Instead of having 1 minyan, they had 4 or 5. They had one at like 6 in the morning to 8. And then they had another one from 9 to 11. Yeah, they davened fast. Yeah, there was no Dvar Torah. Yeah, maybe they skipped a little. But they were able to get everybody who wanted to come and daven to daven standing 6 feet away from each other, wearing masks. So you can adapt, but sometimes you have to obey the law. I know we're going to get to this, but let me just put in my one word because you asked about precedent. We will be facing the following crisis in the next 6 months. I know it 100% certainty. There will be a vaccine. It will be relatively safe and relatively effective. I say relatively because it's not going to be 100%. We're rushing things. Right now, the vaccine that we're looking at from Pfizer looks like it's 90% effective. Will it operate to help older people like me? I don't know. But there will be a relatively safe and effective vaccine. Most people will jump to take it. There will be some who will say, no, we're not going to take it. There will be some who will falsely cite halacha against taking the vaccines. I think they should be exposed. That's not true. There is nothing in halacha which prevents you from taking a vaccine. After all, remember what the Torah says. If there was going to be a bar mitzvah somewhere, imagine there were bar mitzvahs in the time of the Torah, and somebody, citing Vayikra, were to have scabs and pus on his hand, the Torah says he has to be put outside the city. That means he can't come to the bar mitzvah. So we've already answered those questions. We know that emergencies, medical emergencies, require emergency responses, and that includes tremendous concern for health. I mean, after all, Jews invented the washing of hands. Jews invented so many of the rules of cleanliness that other cultures have adapted over time. So we have precedents, but we also have Supreme Court precedents. The United States Supreme Court in 1905, in a case called Jacobson, ironically, a Jewish man in Massachusetts, refused to allow his child to be vaccinated against smallpox. And the Supreme Court upheld mandatory vaccinations, only with a fine, to be sure. But I predict that the Supreme Court will uphold mandatory vaccinations with real sanctions, imprisonment and compulsion. Now, I want to distinguish two things. A vaccine, let's assume they invent a vaccine that prevents me from having a stroke or heart attack or cancer. I am under no obligation to take that vaccine because I can choose life or not under American secular law. But if it's a vaccine that helps prevent the spread to other innocent people, then that becomes compulsory. I have the right to die, but I don't have the right to become Typhoid Mary. I don't have the right to spread the disease. And so precedent, I think, of the Supreme Court and precedent of Jewish halacha will come together, and coupled with Dina Malchut Dina, I think will lead to the conclusion that Jews, Orthodox Jews, very religious Jews, should accept the rule of law and accept the vaccine if it's safe and effective, and if you don't have a medical condition and other reasons that preclude you from taking it. So that's my initial statement, and I'm looking forward to some back and forth and dialogue with the two great rabbis.
Thank you. But just before we go back, I'm sure Rabbi Yaffee has a lot to comment on that. One of the attendees specifically wanted to know about if there's any constitutional question about a mandate requiring mask wearing, or is that just an obvious, emergency law type of thing?
There's no law on it, but the only issue is who has the authority to do it. For the most part, governors and mayors do not have the authority to make law. They only have the authority to implement law. Only the legislature has the right to make law. But if the legislature mandates that everybody who goes outside must wear a mask, and if you don't, you can go to jail, that would be upheld and constitutional. In Israel, they are fining people very significantly. Nobody's going to jail yet, but they're fining people very significantly for violating masking rules. So masking rules would be constitutional. And in general, religious objections don't apply as long as the rules are neutral and applied across the board and are not intended to discriminate against any religion.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. And if anybody has questions they want to put in the chat, I'll try to ask them during our conversation. Rabbi Yaffee, we're going to go to your comments. Any comments on what Professor Dershowitz just said?
Just about every highly recognized and competent halachic authority across the Orthodox board, which is very wide. It's a very broad board. Has basically said that we need to comply with what, not just because the law of the land is the law, but with the mainstream, the fat part of the bell curve of medical opinion.
I agree.
What you have is you have a lot of because as you pointed out, there is no single authority in Jewish law, and it is so fragmented. A lot of people are doing their own thing, and frankly, there are those who slept the most when they were in yeshiva.
And Rabbi Yaffee, we're working here off the premise that this is a medical emergency and it's pikuach nefesh. This is a life-saving, life-saving need, which clearly there's over 230,000. Probably by now it's close to 240,000 Americans dead from the coronavirus. There's no question about that. However, can you talk to us a little bit about what is the definition? When does something become pikuach nefesh? I mean, inherently everything entails a certain amount of risk. What it constitutes, or what are the parameters that we can start using this kind of medical emergency pikuach nefesh method of law?
But when it comes to a communicable disease, the obligation not to inflict harm on another person is much stricter than the obligation to protect yourself from disease, something that actually Alan alluded to, Professor Dershowitz alluded to. And it seems to me that if you look at all the texts on this, that essentially, to the extent that you can prevent even a small percentage of danger, you're obliged to do so. In other words, the Talmud has a definition, of a pandemic, a certain amount of dead people per population and so on. But that was in those days. Again, the Jewish law firmly holds that Talmudic parameters on medical matters are adjusted by whatever our present medical knowledge is.
The way I always put it in terms of health, individual health versus collective health, I think this is just a pithy way of doing it. You have a constitutional right to inhale a cigarette, but you have no constitutional right to exhale a cigarette at me or in a room. So that's the distinction. Now, religious law is always going to be different than secular law. Religious law is largely based on John Stuart Mill that says we do not tell people to do things for their own benefit. We only tell people to do things that won't harm other people. Religious law is much broader. It can tell you to do things for your own benefit.
On that line, one of the dangers, the medical dangers right now, is the spread of misinformation. We know that a lot of people are going to be talking about the dangers of the vaccine. A lot of people are going to be talking about the dangers of wearing masks. There's a lot of talk about, groups out there that are saying that the whole coronavirus is a myth, that the government is trying to, get into everybody's life. So, perceivably, can the US government go so far using this kind of medical need, this emergency need, to stop the spread of coronavirus, to stop even our very First Amendment and our freedom of speech and our freedom of sharing what we believe to be the truth? Can it become illegal to say that this vaccine is dangerous?
I don't think so. I think it can become illegal for doctors to say it, and for pharmaceutical companies that have to get FDA approval. But I think the Constitution gives you the right to be wrong and the right to spread misinformation. Let's just remember, it was Learned Hand who once said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not so sure we're right. In 1928 or 1929, every intelligent person believed that mental retardation was hereditary and that it would be good for the race, meaning humankind, to sterilize women who were in any way mentally challenged. That all came out of Harvard. The president of Harvard, Lowell, was a big supporter of eugenics. He was also a big supporter of, some of the Germans that were pushing that. But Justice Brandeis and Holmes joined that decision. But there were dissenters. The only dissenter was a religious Catholic on the Supreme Court who said no. And it turned out he was right, and all the great scientists were wrong. And so we have to allow for dissent in science, and it's costly because people will die. Free speech is not free. We learned as kids, sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never harm you. False. Names will harm you. False information harms you. And but we may have to live with that false information as part of our freedom of speech under the First Amendment.
Rabbi Yaffee, what would Jewish law have to say about the spread of misinformation or the right, the freedom of speech? Can we curb that?
We do not want to have a chilling effect on people's ability to speak the truth about and to whom they want. And because of this, I would apply this also to bad ideas in medicine and so on, that to some extent we have to let people speak, because sometimes minority ideas, like the idea that microbes can cause disease, which everyone laughed at in 1860, turn out to be the truth. So the very fact that halakha does not give penalties for speaking ill of others applies to speech in general. That we need, that though we have a personal obligation, under Jewish law, there's no freedom of speech. You must only speak good or useful things. But nevertheless, we don't create a system of penalty so as not to chill the weak and quiet voice.
Those are very, very good points. When you allow complete free speech, you're taking enormous risks. Bad speech can sometimes prevail, maybe not permanently. Maybe Martin Luther King is right. The arc points toward justice in the end, but the arc can take a long, 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 long time. So free speech is very dangerous. Short term, it would be so much better to have great people like Rabbi Yaffee be the Platonic guardians and decide which speech is good, which speech is not good. The problem is not everybody's like Rabbi Yaffee. There are people who will make those decisions. So I think John Stuart Mill was wrong when he thought it was win-win. It's not win-win. Allowing all speech can be win-lose, lose-win. And it's a risk we have to take for a variety of other reasons. And on balance, I think I would say you have to allow dangerous speech that might even cost some lives. Now, we have limits. You can't incite violence, but on balance, I think you have to take the risks of free speech, but free speech is not free, and there are great risks involved in allowing it.
Thank you. Professor Dershowitz, one of the questions came through from Scott Snyder, a local attorney here in Portland, and essentially his question is the president able to use wartime powers, or what would it take for a national mask mandate that was done on a federal level?
Okay, I think Congress would have the power to do that. It would need both the House and the Senate and a non-veto by the president. I think diseases go across state lines, so there would be a Commerce Clause justification for a national law. It would be challenged. It would be challenged by people in Montana saying what's good for New York, which has closed spaces, isn't good for Montana or Wyoming. And there would be questions that rose to the United States Supreme Court, probably be resolved in favor of mandatory mask laws, but nobody can be absolutely sure. After all, who are the justices? They're 9 human beings who have strong opinions on things. So I couldn't tell you with great accuracy what the Supreme Court would hold in a case like that.
So the current model where the governors are making decisions is the most effective model?
Unconstitutional. Governors are acting and mayors are acting unconstitutionally all over the country. Governors do not have the power to make laws. You know, we hear the president is the commander in chief. No, he is not the commander in chief. He is the commander in chief of the armed forces. The president can't tell you to do anything. The president can't make you wear a mask. He can't tell you not to wear a mask. He is an ordinary citizen when it comes to making you do things. He only has control over the armed forces. He does not have military control or commander-in-chief control over ordinary citizens. You need Congress to pass laws. Presidents and governors don't get to pass laws.
So one of the things you said is we live in a time of gridlock, but I just want to push back for a moment because we're also living in a time of emergency. So we had people dying in communities throughout the United States, and somebody had to do something and require this social distancing and this mask wearing. Was that illegal? Was that
No, it wasn't illegal for the governor to tell you to wear a mask. It would be illegal for the governor then to say that if you don't wear a mask, you're going to go to jail or you're going to get a $100 fine. You can't, governors cannot create crimes. Only the legislature can. The governors can use their bully pulpits. And in some states, governors have been given the authority by the legislature in emergency times. Congress has given the president some emergency powers. Some of them we don't even know about, they're secret, but others we do know about, but they require particular criteria to be met. And those criteria probably have not been met under this pandemic.
Rabbi Yaffee, I want to move on to, I think we've been mostly all in alignment, and the gist of our conversation has largely been supporting the control of coronavirus, the understanding that both from a Judaic perspective and from a national security and a national health perspective, what's been done has largely been appropriate. Professor Dershowitz said some things have perhaps mayors and governors have perhaps gone beyond their control, but largely there's been a lot of support. So how are we making sure, and what is, how do we control, what is in control for government overreach or for in the courts of Jewish law, what type to ensure that we're not overreaching this thing?
On one hand, I don't think from taking off my halachic stat, from a Judeo-historical perspective, the experience of the Jewish people, I don't think that there's going to be any long-lasting negative effects. The only problem is that typically speaking, because of the nature of governments and bureaucracy, once they start regulating something, it's very hard to get them to stop regulating things.
So I want to ask you for two kind of questions in closing. One is, you spent your life as a civil liberties attorney looking both within the United States and across the world, making sure that minorities aren't persecuted, making sure that people's rights are protected. And I think that there can be a great deal of concern right now. This is happening simultaneously across the entire world. We have some good governments that are acting at the benefit of their citizens, but we also have some nasty regimes, and they're all experiencing this at the same time. How are we looking out for the minorities across the world that are not going to be specifically targeted by regimes under the guise of coronavirus?
Well, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. To quote Thomas Paine, these are the times that try the souls of men and women. We've always seen crises and emergencies being used to deprive people of civil liberties. I mentioned the Japanese detention. 110,000 Japanese Americans were kicked out of the West Coast. Their property was taken away from them. They had to sell them for a nickel on the dollar or a dime on the dollar, much the way the Jews had to sell their property in the early 1930s in Germany. There was a real emergency, Pearl Harbor, but the emergency was used to achieve racist ends. And I think we have to be very concerned about that. We always have to err on the side of protecting civil liberties, protecting emergencies. And we're seeing the most repressive governments use these emergencies. And the interesting thing about the coronavirus, they haven't been better at it than the democratic countries. But all countries have made mistakes. Sweden moved toward herd immunity. It didn't work. Italy took a different approach. It didn't work. Germany seems to have had a good response, but it's picking up in frequency. So we don't know enough about the illness to know what works and doesn't work. We do know two things we didn't know in the beginning. I wrote an article in March that was much criticized, an article in early March saying, don't believe what the scientists are telling you. They're telling you it's not airborne, and they're telling you don't wear masks. People forget that. That's what we heard in March. Don't wear masks, because only the first responders need masks. And in any event, you only get it by touching the surface. It's not airborne. And I wrote an article that was widely circulated saying, believe science, but be skeptical of scientists. And we turned out to be right to be skeptical. So we need to have these things debated, and we need to have organizations whose focus is on human rights and civil liberties. And hopefully we can work together with doctors, with science, and achieve an appropriate balance between protecting civil liberties, protecting civil rights, protecting minorities, but also protecting us all from a horrible magefa, a plague that has changed all of our lives.
Thank you. And one last question is, when we're going to look back at this, we're going to get through it. What do you think we're going to think we did wrong?
Politicize it. I think we're going to think that we were wrong to politicize it, to make it into a political tool. And we've seen that in almost every country. I do think that in the end, the coronavirus had a big impact on this election. And I would hope that when you get something like this, you all can join together and it could unite us the way, for example, 9/11 united us, Pearl Harbor united us. But we live in such a divided country, terribly, that even this plague that affects us all, it didn't unite us, it divided us. And that's what I think we'll look back and look at in regret.
Well, thank you. Rabbi Yaffee, and to you, the same question. In terms of the religious leadership, what do you think they'll think about they did right, and what do you think they'll look back as did wrong?
Interestingly enough, I think, again, as information came in, the religious leadership across the board was actually very good about saying that what we understand scientifically should be implemented. What's interesting is that the same problem we have with the internet is fantastic. I can get thousands of books and speak to thousands of people, but there's a lot of garbage that is coming into Jewish homes and heads that didn't used to come in. And what we saw here were large groups of Jews who listened to, again, whether it's left or right is irrelevant, but who listened to ridiculous, fringe, politicized ideas rather than to their rabbis, rather than to what halakha says, which we've outlined somewhat. And I think that the great lesson is that for the leadership of the Jewish community, we have to be a lot better at getting people to not just to know. People, study a page of Talmud a day, not just to know, but to understand the underlying concepts of Jewish jurisprudence, the underlying systems of halacha, and the spiritual ideas that underlie those. I think that we've allowed too much of our community to be orthopraxis, to fulfill the laws and customs and so on, but not understand what it's about, and not understand its internal workings, and not understand its internal spiritual workings. So we all have to work much harder for people not just to know how halacha works, but to understand the spirit of halacha and how it's driven and what its priorities are. Because a lot of things that are, how am I not going to have a wedding with 300 people? But you know what? The law of pikuach nefesh outweighs that. And one life is worth more than a million weddings. But I would say something else also, that what we did learn in terms of our leadership and the people who took leadership, you know what we did learn? We did learn how much we really take to heart this idea of the love of our fellow. All the charities that sprung up, all the collections that were made for people who suffered from the coronavirus, all the efforts within the Jewish community to help people in the Jewish community and beyond with the economic issues, all the thousands of pieces of medical equipment that people collected in Israel, donated, so as the hospital shouldn't be overwhelmed. Yad Sarah, one of those organizations, that they shouldn't be overwhelmed with patients who could be treated at home. And most of all, what we're doing here, that we found ways to use technology not to spread bad ideas and hatred and stupidities, but we've managed to continue to study Torah together. And, and I'll tell you something, if I add up all the Zoom classes, I have more people studying Torah in Springfield than ever before. So there's a lot of this adversity. It says that, that the Jewish people are like an olive. The more you press it and squeeze it, the better the oil that comes out.
Rabbi Yaffee,
we've really risen to the challenge as a people, and I think we've been a good example for the next.
I agree completely. I think my grandmother would be saying, "I'm ausgesucht," a new Yiddish word, but I'm not ausgesucht. I enjoy having events like this, and you're absolutely right. I think it's going to be the future. I think we're going to be doing more of these. I think we're going to be traveling less on airplanes and doing more of these virtual Divrei Torah and seminars. And I just want to congratulate you for bringing us from Massachusetts to Oregon and allowing us to learn from you, and hopefully you to learn from us. It's great.
Thank you both. It's been wonderful. I'm so glad that you teed yourself up for another invitation by saying we're going to do it again. So
of course.
It's been a great honor, Professor Dershowitz, to have you and to spend this time with you, Rabbi Yaffee. Thank you very much. I think true to your word about the obligation to teach people about the process of Jewish learning and Jewish tradition, I think this hour and a half has been made tremendous progress in that manner. And Professor Dershowitz, thank you for everything you do for defending the civil liberties of all the people. And you start off, when we start off, you said you travel the world helping Jews in need, but I know that you don't differentiate. You travel the world helping people in need, Jewish or non-Jewish. And that's something that's very meaningful to us, and that really comes from the Jewish soul. I'd like to thank everybody who was with us, and I saw our attendance remained very steady throughout the time we were together, so everybody must have very much enjoyed it. Feel free to reach out via email at Rabbi Motti at Chabad, Oregon. You should all have my email, and if not, you can contact me through the manner that you registered. Thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful afternoon.